Now we had a little change in our agenda. So initially we'd asked Apple to come and give an update on HLS. They couldn't get approval, so we had to find an equally interesting presenter, and that's Dom Robinson from Ideas. Now the cool thing is he has just started, along with a couple other folks, a new initiative called Greening of Streaming. So you all may be aware we had been flirting with the idea of doing a program, an initiative around greening. And this was all based on Dom writing an article in Streaming Media Magazine on sustainability and environmental impact of streaming. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's a really great thing. We should do something around this. We didn't have time to really tackle it. And then a year later, Dom launched this concept of greening of streaming. So we pretty much thought, well, let's just work with that organization, right? We don't have to do everything. We just have to make sure that we provide our members resources and we demonstrate to the industry that we're all in this together. And so the idea is that we want to work with Dom's organization regarding one of those pillars of the SVA, right? Sustainability. So with that said, Dom is going to give a little presentation on the greening of streaming. And then he and I are just going to chat, kind of like fireside chat. And then we'll open it up for questions, about, topics that people may want to see greening of streaming address or the SVA address in conjunction with them. So anyway, right now I'll turn it over to Dom to give his presentation.
Thanks, JT. I'm kind of slightly nervous stepping into Apple's shoes. I didn't quite realise that was the score today, so I hope I can entertain nearly as much as a discussion about HLS would have been. But anyway, let me just fire up the screen share, because I think if we do this, does that work?
That works great.
Perfect. Okay. Here are some slides I prepared a few days ago, so I'm not quite sure if they'll be perfectly suited to presenting today, but let me give you a little bit of background to Greening and Streaming. So some of you might well know me. I've been writing for Streaming Media Magazine for 20 or 21 years or something now. But my background actually goes back to 1990 when I started taking images off telescopes as part of an astrophysics degree and making animations over an IP network called Starlink. And that became a fascination which led to me starting to webcast in the mid-90s. And building a CDN which I started in 2001 and ran until about 2008 over here in the UK, one of the early CDNs. And that stayed with me as an interest. So I still to this day currently host the Content Delivery Summit. Again, I think some of you will probably know me through that channel as well. And the combination of running the conference and streaming media together with my day job, which is running Ideas, a software company that sells software into the CDNs and live streaming space, was sort of brought about Eric from Streaming Media agreeing a commission from me to write an article called Greening of Streaming, where it had been prompted by watching a film, as one does when one's wife is away on holiday. One watches films about data centers. And I was quite shocked at how much coal was being mined, principally to power data centers. The film itself highlighted the ones in North Carolina, I believe it was, or Virginia. Anyway, the big data centers there, and it shocked me, and it made me start thinking about our industry and the streaming industry and how much energy our environment used. So at the Content Delivery Summit that came around just after I'd published the article in May last year, I asked some of the CDN architects and engineers where their sustainability considerations were and what they thought about power, and postulated this idea that for 10 years the CDN industry had focused on battling itself on price, had then moved from around 2008 until current to battling on a key battleground of performance. Both of those two having reached quite a sort of commoditized level, whether it was time to start considering power as a key engineering strategy. At the time, most of the CDN architects sort of went, well, isn't that the finance director's decision? The energy bill is amortized in with a lot of our compute and hosting costs. Surely that's really their problem. So there wasn't really an answer, but I was delighted that by the November CDN conference, some of the bigger PLCs had started to make financial statements which included sustainability strategy. And it felt like the story was starting to get through. As JT mentioned, we'd sort of, in parallel to you guys, been thinking about an organization or an organized approach to sustainability within the industry. And I'd registered greeningofstreaming.org and put an email catch-all up, and noticed that there were quite a few people signing up just through the socialization of the idea to getting involved in an organization that may be focused on sustainability issues in the industry. Many years ago, I also was part of the was the first CDN to join the Internet Service Providers Association. I have a long relationship with the guys who started that up, and together we're talking to JT and Mark de Jong at the newly formed CDNA, and to the guys behind ISPA, started to come up with the idea that maybe we needed to create some sort of members group, members association, to bring the parties together and to focus on some collaborative activities. So what we formulated over the year, and we built up to launching on September the 8th this year, was an organisation which set about, largely because it was probably going to come from engineering context, set about to make a real change, partly through education and explaining the challenges, both to the industry and wider, but also directly through engineering. I think there's a lot of problem solvers in the streaming space, and if you put a problem like power inefficiency to them and give them a motivation to address that, there's quite a lot of people quite capable of taking that problem and going, maybe we could do the same thing, but a bit greener or a bit cleaner or a bit more power efficiently. So fundamentally, that's the driver behind greening of streaming, is to bring this idea of power up to being an equal consideration in the architecture of our streaming ecosystems, alongside performance and price. One of the key rules, which was very much enthusiastically agreed at our first members meeting on October the 8th, was that there would be no greenwashing. One of the issues that I've noticed is that we all have an inclination to move towards a sustainability strategy, but it's not our industry. We're not necessarily environmental scientists, and we've come up with an enormous number of different ways to measure our energy and our sustainability use. Some are measuring in watts per frame, some are measuring in petawatts per hour, some are measuring in all sorts of figures, and we need to come up with a collective set of measures and terms and ways to actually communicate what we're doing, both internally and to others. And while there aren't any measures and so on, we've got to bite our lips a bit and avoid greenwashing. You're simply outsourcing your hosting to a cloud provider doesn't mean you've gone green because you're not using any power in your buildings. And we have seen that claim appearing across the sector. The organisation itself, similar to the SVA, is member-driven. So we've got one organisation, one vote. It's non-profit. We have got my company sponsored the sort of foundation of the company, and we put Adam in, a chap called Adam Kerwin, who you guys will meet in due course, to run the secretariat as the exec director. Its aims are to raise profile for itself on recruitment. Obviously, it has to grow to resource itself, but we're going to internalize the member fees and use them for grant funding, for collaborations internally, and for joint research where we can actually get to grips with some of the data out there, gather the information, and collate it in a meaningful way. And we also will take on a role to engage as an industry voice on sustainability issues with press and policymakers, and we're building up to a public launch of the organisation in the UK Parliament on December the 8th. The aim is to engage wider stakeholders in talking to the wider community. You know, we've spoken to politicians who have held up mobile phones and said, well, why is this using any power? It's not connected to anything. So there is quite an educational challenge out there to explain that streaming does use energy. And so we want to try to create a collective point of contact to answer industry questions. I raise a case in point. We've seen the cryptocurrency school of ICT being targeted, if you like, recently for an enormous amount of power use. There was an interesting figure that last year there were around 700,000 GPUs sold into the crypto mining environment alone. I believe in the same span of time, the large OTT operators grew their audiences in the orders of tens of millions. And we have to remember that each of those audience viewers is using a GPU to decode their video. So if cryptocurrency mining is using the energy of a small city, it might be argued a small country, it might be argued that streaming as a whole is using the energy of a much, much larger country. So some interesting press pressure that I anticipate for our industry as people become more aware of the power that our industry uses. Some of the things we've set about doing in our first members meeting, we're keeping it simple. We're learning the ropes. We're learning what the members would like to do. But we started off with two key working groups. One we called Lexicon, which, as I mentioned earlier, we need to sort of agree terminology in the industry, agree measures. We can't try to move the needle until we all agree where the needle is. So the first working group, we're going to try and collate some of the terminology that's being used by our member organisations and terminology that those member organisations have seen used, and try to bring that down into a consistent set of data terms that we can use across all our members, both as the output of greening and streaming, and hopefully members will adopt those terms widely in their own sustainability and communications about sustainability. So that goes for measures as well. The second working group is a key one for the sustainability of the organisation itself. So we've got an outreach working group, which is focused both on member growth and on stakeholder / the formal title is civil society engagement. I've mentioned the UK Parliament launch. What we're setting about with that working group is we're going to be conducting a very simple 5-question poll to about 50,000 people in advance of the December group to see what the general public understands about streaming and where power is used in when they're watching video. And then the final working group, which will probably only be possible to launch once we've got working group 1 in place, is a best practice working group, which everybody's highly motivated to work towards, to share common thinking about efficiency in the streaming ecosystem, to establish where the needle is, and to come up with a collective view of how we move the needle. So yes, that's an introduction to greening of streaming. I hope that made some sense. JT.
Yes, sir. That did make a lot of sense. That was, that was fantastic. Oh, failed to start video camera. Great.
Don't leave me on. I'm ugly. We need your face.
No, that was on my end. Oh, I have there we go. Okay. Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about now, Dom. I know that you guys had an event, and obviously we participated in that event to talk a little bit about, how the SVA is approaching streaming. But can you talk a little bit about sort of, you had a lot of great presentations. What was something like? What were the top 3 takeaways that you got from that event across all of your presentations?
So the keynote we had was from a chap called Dan Sheen. I wanted to start it off with someone who was neutral to the streaming industry. So I approached Dan Sheen from a group called Dimpact. He has a lot of experience. He's worked with probably many of your members actually, looking at application efficiency quite broadly, and so on. In trying to find somebody who could educate me, and one of the things I'm enjoying about this is being quite naive to the space and asking dumb questions. But one of the things I asked him to sort of help me understand was the terminology that was used in trying to measure power efficiency in this application. And broadly, it's still kind of a bit archaic term, but the ICT space as a whole. And so we asked Dan to give us a sort of big picture of what was going on and what the measures were. One of the takeaways, these numbers, I'm hesitant to use too many, and certainly not to go into too much detail, because I haven't yet found a data set that I firmly agree with. But there are ways of measuring the streaming ecosystem to put it on par with an energy use. And energy and electricity are kind of very mixable terms at the moment, but an energy use globally, possibly on par with the aviation industry. And one of the things that I've always, greening of streaming is ultimately a noble cause. It's there because I think it's the right thing to do. But one of the things that excites me is the streaming industry, and potentially the connections that you, me, the people I know in the industry have, it's still reasonably small and addressable group. And if we collectively decide to make a difference, then, you know, within a group of 200, 300, 400 people, we might be able to put 10% efficiency into what we're doing if we think cleverly. And being able to look at the aviation industry and think we could make a 10% energy saving on the aviation industry would be quite a significant thing to do. So if we're really going to measure ourselves on par with the aviation industry and aspire to that type of improvement, I think that's quite exciting. So that was that was exciting, if you like, as a key opening speech. We then had, so Akamai, I must call out Akamai and Intel. They've been key supporters of the idea of greening of streaming from when I first put it to them. So we asked them to come and be anchor speakers for the first event. And it was really interesting looking at both the challenge that Akamai have had as their demand for traffic has grown, particularly over the last couple of years, but also how they've been managing to keep the power demand under control by smart technology strategy, which is good. And again, Intel and Varnish have been working hard on optimizing deployment through deployment of caching and so on, and better use of their silicon broadly, I think is the right term. So that was good. We then had a sort of a speed dating session. There were about 8 or 10 companies, and we'd only scheduled 2 hours. So we decided to invite them all in, but give them all 5 minutes. And I think that included you and Mark, and we overran horrifically, but that was good. It was a testament to the fact that everyone's got a lot to say in the space, and there is a lot of collective thinking. So you know, there are companies which have had a green strategy from the outset, and particularly I was impressed by Jetstream's slides. They've really gone back into when they sort of established their CDN in the late 90s and really thought green from the outset, and that was good. There were companies which were pivoting today and trying to do the same but more power efficiently by better use of codecs, better use of compression, and so on. There's lots of touch points where we can address things. I'm not going to call anyone out particularly. There were also some sustainability strategies introduced, which I did think were risking being greenwashing. I think they were done with honest intent, but I think there were some strategies which have been carried out without a wider consideration of the ecosystem. And there's one globally known household company, which I'm definitely not going to name because I'd like them to be a member, but there was one company out there which has done an amazing net zero output recently. And when you go into the small print, they don't include anything to do with their distribution of CPE, consumer premises. So an OTT provider which doesn't include the 99% of the entire ecosystem, which means that all the devices decoding their video are not in some way burning power because of their service. I think it does need a bit of cooling out, but we're going to do that gently.
I mean, and that makes sense. And it's interesting. I was just thinking, you just made me think, like, you know, we did our live streaming working group did a document on best practices for reducing live stream latency. And they looked at across the entire workflow. And I wonder if a similar format document wouldn't be cool for our two organizations to partner on, really looking at where across the across the entire workflow, where are the places that, you know, consume most power, consume less power, can be optimized. I remember, you know, when I was working at Limelight, you know, one of the things that they had come to, maybe it was a few years before I left, was this concept of gigabits per watt, right? That was the idea of measuring, you know, the efficiency of a server and how much power it consumed. And I mean, I thought that was like, that's a step in the right direction. Optimize your software so that you use less power, and then ultimately you use less servers, and so then you save yourself money, and you're good to the environment, kind of. But I thought that was really cool. What in terms of in terms of next steps, like what do you guys see? I mean, I know they had the presentation, but in terms of just like tactical, what do you want to tackle first? What do you want to see greening of streaming, put out that would really sort of help streaming companies be greener?
So what I'd really like to do, especially thinking about collaborating with the SVA, I'd really like to get as many of your members to participate and input data about how they're measuring their sustainability, and get that in the first instance into our Lexicon working group, so that we can really understand what we're trying to measure. And then that's going to get circulated and agreed by our members, and very much hopefully made public. We need to, we're a members-led organisation, so we need to put that to the other members. But the idea is that that would be made public, and so we can feed that back to you guys. And if you guys are then doing hardcore innovation work at the sort of more scientific end of making things work as well as they can, regardless of the pricing, the power requirements, which is one would expect on an engineering floor when you're pushing the boundaries, to think like that. But as we start to think about bringing that technology into production, to try to get you guys to make sure it passes through a sustainability review, which we can feed into to help you guys measure and to help you guys understand, and then hopefully the production ready technologies will be not only as performant as possible, but also have as little power impact as possible. And I think that seems like an obvious tie to form between the two organizations as far as we can.
And I like that. And it's interesting, there is, in the US, we have this, sort of energy compliance organization that's part of the government, right? And you can get, as a electronics manufacturer, you can get sort of certified that your device complies with, it's energy efficient. And a lot of that applies to our homes and home builds as well. And so, maybe in the future, there's a way for greening of streaming to almost do that, right? Is to provide certification for streaming workflow technology vendors to say, like, your box, your software, your whatever your thing you do for the streaming workflow is energy efficient, or streaming efficient, greening efficient, whatever that thing becomes. But that that might be very interesting to see, like, everybody get on board, and then hopefully you get like content providers and platform operators who are building streaming workflows are saying, like, we are so committed to sustainability, we're only using vendors that have the the seal of approval.
We did definitely think about from the outset having that, but then we realized we didn't have the measures and also I'm very keen that we don't become something that you can game. There's as soon as you set a certification standard, it's something that has great value on one side, but can also be gamed. And I think it's more important to get the sort of sentiment in the engineering community thinking, well, I'm a techie, ultimately. If I don't want to implement it, I won't. So I can sort of, if you like, be a bit direct action about things and say, I'm only going to implement it if it is power efficient, because I'm the engineer here. And I think I'd rather engineer that sentiment and have a real sense that as an industry we're working together to a real end, because sustainability isn't ultimately something worth gaming. It's worth something doing right.
And that's really what you're after. Is you're after behavior change, right? I mean, it's not just a stamp. Like, I mean, that to me is interesting and cool, but really you're after changing people's feelings towards the importance of sustainability. So right now it's an afterthought. In a lot of ways, it's an afterthought.
One of the things I find really interesting is there's lots of talk about more efficient codecs, about more power efficient codecs and so on. And we have to keep pursuing that as a goal for any new build. But it doesn't necessarily solve the legacy problem. Transcoding an enormous library of content, which nobody's going to, long tail content, which nobody's ever going to watch. It's probably going to use more power to make it possible that one or two people might watch one or two of the videos than it will ever use by saving the power that the video compression and subsequent distribution will roll out. And simply driving demand for that sort of thing has other complexities as well. So it is not a world without its politics, but we're trying to keep it engineering.
Well, that's what I was going to say. I mean, how do you, in a sense, like, how do you get away from the politics of, for example, people swapping devices out every, 8 to 12 months because they want a better screen and more resolution for video and better cameras and things like that. Does, obviously I don't think you're going to address those parts. How do you?
It's a great point. So one of the reasons why I went to the ISPA folks when seeking advice on setting up is that the Internet Service Providers Association has been very, very successful at maintaining the self-regulation of the internet providers. Trade groups, members groups are extremely good in the face of regulation at helping to infuse policy without needing to make it as constrictive as law. But one of the best things to do is to constantly engage the policymakers and the politicians and the regulators that it's sort of in the halo around the industry sector, to make sure that they feel that they can communicate with the industry as a whole. And by putting greening streaming forward as a bit of a mouthpiece to engage with that, at least we can get the shots fired in the right direction from the right places. And I think having direct engagement with Parliament, Congress, European Parliament, which we are developing, to act as a point of contact as and when the spectre of isn't this streaming using a lot of electricity gets raised by the general public and by the policymakers, we can at least capture that as a focal point for the engagement, and for certainly for the bigger PLCs and the companies which have got sort of public accountability, help to marshal an industry-wide point of view rather than letting each company fend for itself with different sets of measures and different languages and different objectives. So I think there is an element where we only win if we all win in this particular one. So collaboration amongst the members in the face of these sort of policy engagements, I think, is going to be important.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So thinking about, how we get people to change behavior, what do you guys have thoughts around that? Is it, training, education, just materials that you can send out, conversations around the water cooler? Like, how do you get people to change?
I don't know. It's very early days for me to really be saying if an idea like this will actually happen. But as a straw man for what might happen, one of our members has been trying Green Button on their OTT services, which basically sets your whole streaming experience up to use minimum rather than maximum resolution and quality and bit rate and throughput and so on. So simple consumer opt-in, the red button service has always been good for that. Green button services is a very novel idea, and I think that's one that I'd really like to see the members discussing, exploring more between each other, seeing if they really work. It reminds me of Earth Definition, which Earth Day did as well. So I think that's from memory is earthdefinition.org, which was an interesting move to put a little green tag by the 480p stream option on your phone, so that you're not sitting trying to watch 16K UHD on a phone that's the size of your finger, because that's frankly a waste of everything. Yep. And I think that's a very direct way of aligning the engineering and the consumer. And it's just one way, and it may not be the way that greening streaming members elect to sort of establish, but I think it's a good example of how things I've seen over the last couple of years are looking into this space have been attempted, at least. So.
Well, and there's definitely some technology changes there, right? I mean, the player we know is greedy, right? It goes for the highest bit rate to fill the most available bandwidth. The engineer has to engineer the player not to do that. Like, don't especially on a mobile phone, like what you said. You can't tell the difference on a mobile phone, and I've got an iPhone 13. I can't tell the difference between 720p and 4K on it. Like, there's absolutely no visual difference to me. And so, yeah, that wastes a lot of power. That wastes a lot of environmental resources, has a much bigger climate impact if we're delivering, a lot more bits to a screen that just, it just doesn't make a difference.
We're also, I think it's also useful to mention that we're also obviously trying to engage with the big conferencing tool vendors as well. It's not just about the one-to-many consumer experience. It's I don't know if you're like me, but I've had video conferencing tools on my desktop for 15-20 years. Yeah. It's only since my mum and dad came online last spring that I've started turning the video camera on, and actually I find it counter to productivity, because I'm sort of staring at a camera rather than looking at three screens and jumping around doing whatever I'm doing while I'm working. So for what it's worth, just because we can turn a video on, is it necessarily a better thing? We need to discuss those things and understand them. They obviously have economic impacts, and there's shareholder value that needs to be weighed in with those decisions. But as the shareholders and wider stakeholder community are starting to look at the share price of larger companies being affected by sustainability strategy, I think now is the time to be having those discussions anyway.
No, I mean that's interesting. Like obviously there are lots of times I don't turn the camera on because I just woke up and I like rolled into the office and I'm not getting on camera. But that brings up a really good point. It's like, do we all remember the days where we just used to dial into a conference call?
Yeah.
Why do we need video every single time? We just don't. Mind you, it does provide great opportunities to laugh, like when some idiot puts the cat filter on and can't get it off. But I think that the greater sustainability is probably a bigger concern that we should have. So that's really interesting. All right, we've got a few minutes left, so I just want to remind everybody that if you got a question, go ahead and drop it into Slido. Obviously this recording will be available after the fact, so you can always ping Dom, about greening of streaming, etc. So obviously we want to work together, right? That's a big thing for us. Is I personally have a stake in sustainability. I think that's important. Obviously, we need to figure out ways that we can reduce the impact, the climate impact, the environmental impact, the carbon footprint of streaming as it grows, because it's just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. In terms of your experience in streaming, Dom, what do you feel right now is something that could be a quick win for companies in the streaming industry to reduce their sort of power consumption, their carbon footprint, whatever. What's something that you would say like, oh my gosh, everyone should be doing this?
Wow. There's so
I love putting people on the spot.
Yeah. There's so many touch points. I think we need to do some soul searching about where we need to push the user experience in terms of quality. I think we just touched on it a little bit. We might be sacklessly pushing the quality up beyond a human perception in the field. I'm not arguing in any way that we shouldn't be pushing those boundaries, because in the production side, 16K, whatever, they enhance they enhance the content creation process for sure. But in terms of the consumer demand, I think we might have some responsibility to go and assess where the consumer finds good enough to be good enough, and where we actually try to work out where it's becoming sacklessly good, but with an unnecessary power demand. The other thing is obviously, it's an obvious push to make sure that your supply chains into your data centers, into your caches and so on, that you're pushing those guys to at least be renewable, that you're using your buying power to try to improve your competitive market from your suppliers so that they are supplying you more renewable resources. But that can get a bit lazy. You don't just want to shift to renewable and say that's the job. Actually, by improving your power consumption, whatever the source supply, is a much more direct way of not only reducing your power demand, whatever the source is, and freeing up renewables for other technology, other uses in the wider sort of civil society term is the one that jumps to mind. But also it pleases the finance director. If you reduce your power bill, then you reduce your power bill, and that's no bad thing. So,
no, it has
not very political, but it is just a very straightforward fact that we can get the finance directors on board by just pointing out it's going to reduce the bill.
Numbers. It's all about numbers.
Yeah.
No, I remember reading a while back how there were some data centers, like Yahoo was experimenting with data center design. They had this sort of chicken coop approach where it provide a much more natural cooling, so they didn't have to spend money on power to cool. They could just use the environment. And I know that there are other providers that have put big data centers underground, again, as a way of let's reduce the power requirement for cooling, and rely more on sort of the natural environment. Are you guys also looking at engaging with folks sort of not necessarily in the streaming workflow, but adjacent to it, sort of in that ecosystem?
Yes, and I'm going to have to jump, because in about 3 minutes, I'm jumping over to talk to a guy who was part of the team that ran the transoceanic fiber from the east to the west coast of the Pacific.
Wow!
And he's now building cable landing stations and data centers, and he was very much down into the fabric end of things, because 70% of the networks, God knows how much of the data centers are being used to provision the streaming services at the moment, but the bottleneck is power. despite what the CDNs tell you, the bottleneck is actually power. Finding a location where you can land a cable near a metro zone with a data center and provide that data center with 2 or more power supplies of 150 megawatt is a really difficult exercise. And it feels like it's a million light years away from video compression and waving your hand at a camera in OBS. But in practice, it's that's very, very much part of the fabric and the infrastructure. And so we are trying to go end to end. We're hoping to get through to the sort of chip vendor end and the CPU manufacturer end as well. So it's interesting. We could wash our hands and say it's streaming. Everything happens in someone else's infrastructure. Or we can take ownership of the problem and say we're driving the demand for this infrastructure. Let's see what we can do in our part to improve the efficiency.
Very cool. All right, Dom, that was fantastic. We don't have any questions, so that's great. We're wrapping up here, and then we've got a break. And again, thank you so much for taking the time on short notice to come and talk to us about the greening of streaming and sustainability. It's really important. We all need to be paying attention to this. So again, thanks so much.
Please get in touch. Yeah, please get in touch.
Absolutely. And if anybody has any questions, just visit greeningofstreaming.com and reach out to those folks, and hopefully or .orgn.com. Look at that. And hopefully they can get the questions answered. So anyway,